Judge Malcolm Robinson's arrival in the quaint town of Grafton, Mississippi, is met with quiet resistance and subtle prejudice. His efforts to bring justice and reform are soon overshadowed by a disturbing incident at a local convenience store. Wrongfully accused and handcuffed by Officer Travis Walker, Malcolm faces a stark reminder of the town's deep-seated biases. As tensions rise, his attorney Sarah Henderson steps in to challenge the injustice. Will Malcolm's quest for change overcome the town's resistance? If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Malcolm Robinson had navigated his fair share of courtrooms throughout his career. Some were filled with an air of quiet dignity, the kind where the seriousness of the proceedings was palpable in every corner. Others were chaotic, a maelstrom of noise and confusion that seemed almost to spill over the edges of the benches and desks. Yet, as he approached the small, conservative town of Grafton, Mississippi, a new and unfamiliar kind of tension settled heavily in his chest. This was a tension not born of legal arguments or courtroom drama, but of unspoken words and silent judgments. It was the kind of tension that came from being observed, scrutinized, and prejudged without a single word exchanged. The town itself was a picturesque slice of traditional America, its charm a familiar tableau of neat little houses. A town square graced by a fountain that had long since seen its last coat of paint, and rows of pickup trucks lined up outside the few local stores. Everything about Grafton seemed to embody a kind of quaint, timeless simplicity. There was nothing overtly alarming about the scene, yet Malcolm couldn't shake the acute sensation of being an outsider. As he drove down Main Street and parked his car in front of the courthouse, an old stone edifice with white columns that tried to project an image of justice and fairness, he couldn't ignore the sense that beneath the surface, something more complex and less welcoming lurked. He stepped out of his car, his 6'2" frame inevitably drawing attention from the locals who were casually milling about. Dressed in his usual sharp, tailored suit, Malcolm felt the weight of their gazes pressing down on him. "Who is that?" a woman muttered to her companion as they passed by, her grip on her grocery bag tightening slightly. Her friend whispered back, her eyes narrowing with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "I heard we're getting a new judge," she said. Didn't think he'd look like that. Malcolm chose to ignore the whispered exchange, not because it didn't sting, but because it was a scenario all too familiar. After decades of being the only black man in various professional settings, he had become adept at letting such comments roll off his back, at least outwardly. Internally, each comment was a seed planted in the soil of his consciousness, one that could potentially sprout into something more consequential. Inside the courthouse, Malcolm was introduced to Richard Myers, the town's police chief. Richard's handshake was firm but lacked warmth, his sharp blue eyes scanning Malcolm from head to toe with the scrutiny of someone assessing an opponent in a competitive match. "Judge Robinson, welcome to Grafton. I trust the drive wasn't too difficult," Richard said, his thin smile betraying a hint of calculation. He was shorter than Malcolm, stocky with graying hair, and his badge gleamed under the courthouse lights, as if to emphasize his authority. "No complaints," Malcolm replied, meeting Richard's gaze with equal measure. "I'm looking forward to getting settled and making some improvements around here." "Improvements?" Richard's smile faltered slightly, his demeanor hardening. "You know, we've got a good system here. No need to shake things up too much." Malcolm arched an eyebrow, letting a hint of challenge seep into his voice. "I'll be the judge of that once I've had a chance to assess things. Reform is often needed in places that appear to be working just fine." He let the implication hang in the air between them. Richard cleared his throat, an almost imperceptible sign of discomfort. "Of course. Well, I'm sure you'll find the folks here are welcoming once you get to know them. Small towns tend to be set in their ways, but we get along." Malcolm fought to suppress a smirk. "We'll see about that." The following days were spent settling into the modest house he had rented on the edge of town. It was a small, unassuming place with a quiet front porch and a yard that abutted a line of trees. From the outside it appeared peaceful, but Malcolm knew better than to expect true tranquility. Having fought for justice in larger cities where systemic issues were out in the open, he was well aware that the quiet he encountered here was more likely to be the kind that festered just beneath the surface. A subtle form of racism that made the air thick and heavy. His first real attempt at friendliness came from Ethan Cooper, his next-door neighbor. Ethan approached Malcolm across the lawn, holding 2 bottles of beer. He was a scruffy-looking man about Malcolm's age, with shaggy brown hair and an air of casual ease. "Malcolm, right?" Ethan called out, a friendly grin on his face. "Welcome to the neighborhood." Malcolm offered a genuine smile in return. "Thanks, I appreciate it. You're the first person to say that out loud." Ethan chuckled, as he handed Malcolm a beer. "Grafton's. Well, it's Grafton. People aren't quick to warm up to anyone they don't know, and I'm guessing it'll take them even longer with you." Malcolm took a sip of his beer, appreciating the straightforwardness. "Let me guess, small-town politics, resistance to change, and a lot of we've always done it this way." Ethan confirmed with a nod and a swig from his bottle. "You've got it. I moved here a few years back for the peace. Didn't realize how much that quiet could weigh on a person." Malcolm raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "That bad?" Ethan glanced around cautiously, as though he wanted to ensure no one was eavesdropping. "It's not blatant, but you'll notice it," he said in a low voice. "People here don't like anyone who rocks the boat. I don't want to sugarcoat it for you. You've got your work cut out for you." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, absorbing the weight of Ethan's words. "I figured as much," he said, already feeling the gravity of the challenge ahead settling heavily on his shoulders. The first day in court did little to ease his apprehension. Malcolm had reviewed the local cases, mostly routine and mundane, but it was the reactions he encountered that were troubling. The bailiff, an older white man named Henry, barely met his eye. The local attorneys appeared visibly surprised by his presence, their reactions ranging from mild surprise to thinly veiled skepticism. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Malcolm Robinson," Henry announced, but his voice lacked the respectful tone Malcolm was accustomed to. As Malcolm took his seat at the bench, he scanned the courtroom. The gallery was sparsely populated, filled mostly with locals who had wandered in out of curiosity. Malcolm could feel their stares, a palpable sense of anticipation hanging in the air, as though they were waiting for him to falter, to validate their unspoken assumptions. The cases proceeded with a disheartening rhythm. Each ruling was met with murmurs of discontent and quiet resentment. By the time he wrapped up the final case of the day, an older attorney approached him. "Judge Robinson," the man began, his voice polite but cold. "I'm Tom White. I've been practicing law here for 30 years. Just wanted to introduce myself." Malcolm extended a hand. "Pleasure to meet you." Tom shook it briefly, his eyes scrutinizing Malcolm with the same hesitation he had noticed from the townspeople. "You'll find things are a bit different here than wherever you came from. Folks around here prefer to keep things simple." Malcolm resisted the urge to sigh. "I'll do my best to respect that, but justice is rarely simple, Mr. White." Of course," Tom replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Just thought I'd offer some friendly advice. Sometimes the best thing you can do is let things lie. You'll save yourself a lot of trouble." Malcolm forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm not much for letting things lie, but I appreciate your concern. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment number 1 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me." As he walked out of the courthouse that evening, the sun setting low over the town, Malcolm's phone buzzed with a message from Sarah Henderson, a civil rights attorney he'd been in touch with before moving. "How's the new place treating you?" the text read. Malcolm stared at it, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. How could he explain the disheartening reality he faced, that the town was exactly as he had feared, with change proving to be a daunting challenge? Instead, he typed out, "It's everything I expected." The next morning brought an unexpected shift in Malcolm's world. As he sat in his car, about to enter the local convenience store, the stifling heat outside felt almost oppressive, clinging to him like a second skin. He hesitated for a moment, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. It was just a simple errand, but in this town, every action seemed to carry extra weight. Adjusting his tie, he pushed open the door to the small store, the bell chiming overhead. Inside, the air conditioning offered a brief respite, but the atmosphere was thick with tension. The shelves were cluttered with the usual small-town staples, canned goods, dusty magazines, and a few worn racks of snacks. As Malcolm made his way toward the back of the store, he noticed the cashier, a middle-aged woman, casting a furtive glance at him before quickly turning away. It was the same quiet unease he had encountered before, a subtle discomfort that felt like a series of small cuts. Reaching the drink aisle, Malcolm overheard whispers from other customers. "Who's that? Don't recognize him," a man murmured to his wife near the front counter. "Must be new in town," she replied, her tone sharp with suspicion. Malcolm sighed inwardly and continued browsing, focusing on his task of picking up essentials. As he approached the register with a bottle of water, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A man in uniform had entered the store with a noticeable air of authority. Officer Travis Walker, the man announced himself before even reaching Malcolm, his voice gruff and carrying an edge that drew the attention of everyone in the store. Walker, broad and imposing, approached Malcolm with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. "You Walker," he said, pointing directly at Malcolm. "Got a minute?" Malcolm frowned. "Is there a problem, officer?" "Maybe," Walker replied, his tone indifferent. "We've had reports about someone matching your description. I'm just here to ask you a few questions." "Reports," Malcolm repeated, keeping his voice steady. "I'm here to pick up a few things. That's all." The officer's gaze was unyielding, and Malcolm could sense that this encounter was about to shift the dynamics of his arrival in Grafton in ways he had yet to fully understand. Walker took a decisive step closer, intruding upon Malcolm's personal space with an air of authority. "We've received a report about a suspicious individual in this store. Described as having a dark complexion and being tall fits your description pretty well." A hush fell over the store as all the customers fell silent, their attention now focused on the unfolding drama. The cashier, who had previously been feigning busyness, now openly stared with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Malcolm's heart rate accelerated, but he fought to keep his demeanor calm and collected. "I'm the new judge here," Malcolm said, his voice steady as he reached into his pocket and produced his wallet, revealing his official ID. "There's no need for this kind of treatment." However, Walker didn't even glance at the ID. His expression remained steely and unyielding. "Judge, huh? We'll see about that. I need you to step outside with me. This needs to be resolved." "I haven't done anything wrong," Malcolm said firmly, his tone unwavering. "I'm not going anywhere. If you need to verify my identity, you can make a call, but I refuse to leave this store as if I were a criminal." Walker's face twisted into a sneer, his patience wearing thin. "You think you can dictate how I do my job? You're acting suspiciously, and that's reason enough for me." The tension in the store was almost tangible, the air thick with unease. Malcolm could feel the weight of every gaze upon him, some eyes curious, others disapproving, but none offering any help. "I'm not resisting," Officer Malcolm said, raising his hands slightly to the sides in a gesture of non-aggression, "but I refuse to be publicly humiliated. I am aware of my rights." Walker let out a harsh, mirthless laugh. "Your rights in this town? You're just another troublemaker. Now, are you coming with me voluntarily, or do I need to make you?" At that moment, the store's door swung open once more, and Ethan walked in, having seen Malcolm's car outside, and decided to investigate. "Hey, Malcolm," Ethan called out, his voice tinged with confusion as he took in the scene. "What's going on here?" Walker didn't even bother turning around. "Stay out of this, Cooper," he barked, clearly recognizing Ethan. "This is official police business." Ethan frowned, his concern growing. "Malcolm's no criminal, Walker. He's a judge. For God's sake, why don't you just back off?" Walker glared at Ethan with a mixture of irritation and disdain. "Just because he's a judge doesn't mean the rules don't apply. He's behaving suspiciously, and I'm dealing with it." Ethan shook his head, his frustration evident. "Suspicious? What, because he's buying a bottle of water? This is ridiculous." Walker was already pulling out his handcuffs, his patience exhausted. "Enough talk. You're coming with me," he said, reaching for Malcolm's arm. Malcolm instinctively stepped back, his voice rising in protest. "This is entirely unnecessary. I've shown you who I am, and you're still treating me like a criminal." The store was now eerily silent, every customer watching with wide eyes as the confrontation escalated. Walker's face was a mask of determination as he grabbed Malcolm's wrist, twisting it behind his back with a roughness that made Malcolm wince in pain. "Stop this," Ethan shouted, stepping forward. However, Walker's cold glare froze him in his tracks. "Stay out of it, Cooper. This is your last warning." Malcolm, his jaw clenched tightly, felt the cold metal of the handcuffs snap shut around his wrists. His breath came in short, controlled bursts, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "You're making a mistake," he said through gritted teeth. "This will not end well for you." Walker ignored Malcolm's warning, turning him toward the door. "We'll see about that. Let's go outside." As Malcolm stepped out into the blinding sunlight, his hands cuffed behind him, each step felt like a humiliating procession. A crowd had gathered outside, some people whispering among themselves, others holding up their phones to record the incident. Ethan followed closely, his face pale with disbelief. "This is insane," Ethan muttered, rushing to Malcolm's side. Walker, showing no sign of empathy, shoved Malcolm into the back seat of the patrol car. Malcolm, keeping his voice tight but controlled, said, "Don't worry, this isn't over." Walker slammed the car door shut and turned to face Ethan. "You better stay out of this if you know what's good for you, Cooper. We don't take kindly to interference." Ethan's eyes burned with anger, but he knew there was little he could do at that moment. As the patrol car pulled away, Malcolm leaned back against the seat, the handcuffs biting into his wrists. His mind raced not just with anger, but with a deeper, more unsettling realization. This wasn't merely about his predicament, it was about the town, the justice system, and the very fabric of the place he had come to reform. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment number 2 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. He hadn't been there long, but it was already evident that Grafton had no intention of letting him through the doors without a struggle. The fluorescent lights inside the police station emitted a persistent, irritating hum, which only compounded the disorienting sense of confinement Malcolm felt as he sat alone in the cold, unwelcoming holding room. The tightness of the handcuffs had left his wrists throbbing in pain, and as he stared at the drab, unadorned walls, he struggled to suppress the intense, simmering rage bubbling within him. Across the table from him, Travis Walker stood with an unmistakable air of self-satisfaction. The officer's smirk was barely concealed, playing at the corners of his mouth as if it were a badge of honor. Despite Malcolm's calm demeanor, which filled the room with an almost palpable authority, he recognized the type all too well. Men like Travis thrived on power, particularly the kind that could wield over those they perceived as different or threatening. "I told you," Malcolm said, his voice deliberately low but unwavering. "I am Judge Robinson. This is a serious error, and every moment you keep me here only makes it worse." Walker didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned to one of the younger officers, who appeared visibly uncomfortable with the situation. "Run his ID again. Confirm his identity." The younger officer hesitated, clearly uneasy about the situation. Officer Walker, I think." Walker interrupted sharply, his tone brooking no argument. "Do it now." Malcolm leaned slightly forward, never breaking eye contact with Walker. "You know I'm telling the truth. This is personal for you, isn't it? You've already made up your mind about me." Walker's smirk vanished, replaced by a cold, unreadable expression. He moved around the desk to stand directly in front of Malcolm, towering over him with a menacing presence. "Let me explain something to you," Judge Walker said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Things work a certain way around here. You might be a big-shot judge in your world, but here you're just another person who needs to be kept in line." Malcolm's gaze remained steady, though inside, his anger was simmering dangerously. "And what exactly does that mean, Officer Walker? That you have the authority to arrest anyone you dislike simply because of their appearance?" Walker sneered. "You're the one making this about race." Malcolm let out a sharp breath, his patience wearing thin. "You think I haven't encountered this before? I've dedicated my career to fighting people like you, those who hide behind a badge to shield their ignorance. Do you think you're safeguarding this town? All you're doing is revealing its darkest undercurrents." Walker's voice grew low and threatening. "Careful now. You're treading on thin ice." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his voice calm but resolute. "No, Officer Walker, you're the one stepping out of line." Outside the station, word of the incident was beginning to spread. Ethan had called Sarah Henderson, and it didn't take long for the news to attract a small crowd. By the time Sarah arrived, a handful of onlookers had gathered on the sidewalk, whispering amongst themselves about the unfolding drama inside. Sarah pushed through the crowd with determined purpose, her eyes scanning for any sign of trouble. Ethan caught up to her, his face etched with concern. "Sarah, thank God you're here," Ethan said, his voice taut with worry. "Walker is out of control. He's trying to make an example out of Malcolm." Sarah's expression hardened. "I'll handle it. The situation can't escalate any further." Ethan followed her as she marched through the entrance and approached the front desk, where a young officer looked both nervous and overwhelmed. "I'm Sarah Henderson, Malcolm Robinson's attorney," she said, her voice firm and authoritative. "I need to see him immediately." The officer glanced between her and Ethan, who was standing close by. I'm not sure if that's..." Sarah cut him off with icy precision. "Let me be very clear. I will see my client or this situation will become exceedingly difficult for your department." The officer swallowed nervously, clearly out of his depth. Let me get Officer Walker." "That's a good idea," Sarah replied crisply. Back in the holding room, Walker was still basking in his temporary authority. The door swung open abruptly, and as Sarah entered, the atmosphere in the room shifted palpably. "That's enough," Sarah declared, her gaze locking onto Walker with unwavering authority. "Uncuff him immediately." Walker turned slowly, his expression darkening upon seeing her. "And who the hell are you?" "I'm his attorney," Sarah shot back. "And you're about to find yourself in a lot of trouble. I suggest you listen very carefully to what I'm about to say." Walker hesitated, his hand hovering near his holster as if to reassert his control. But Sarah was undeterred. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous tone. "Do you want to explain to the entire country why you illegally detained a sitting judge? Think very carefully, Officer Walker." Malcolm remained silent, observing the tense standoff, but he could sense the shift in the room. Sarah was a formidable presence, and Walker was unaccustomed to anyone challenging him, especially not a woman of color. "I'm not intimidated by a lawyer," Walker sneered, though his bravado was faltering. "You should be," Sarah said coolly, "because I intend to file a lawsuit against you and this entire department for wrongful arrest and misconduct. Unless, of course, you release him immediately and avoid turning this into a public spectacle of your gross incompetence." Walker's face flushed with anger, but he knew when he was cornered. With a sharp exhale, he yanked the keys from his belt and wrenched the handcuffs off Malcolm's wrists. Malcolm stood slowly, rubbing his sore wrists as he faced Walker. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his voice steady. "You will answer for this." Walker remained silent, but the fury in his eyes spoke volumes. This confrontation was far from resolved. As they exited the station, Sarah, Malcolm, and Ethan were met by the small crowd that had gathered. Someone had been recording the events on their phone, and Malcolm was certain that by morning, the entire town and possibly even the nation would be aware of what had transpired. "You okay?" Ethan asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "I'm fine," Malcolm replied, though he didn't truly feel it. His anger simmered just beneath the surface, but he forced himself to maintain composure. Sarah turned to him, her expression serious. "Malcolm, this is no longer just about you. Walker isn't merely a bad apple. He's a symptom of a much deeper issue." "You're right," Malcolm said heavily. "And that's why we can't let this go. Walker thinks he's untouchable because he's shielded by the system, but we're going to expose him and the system he represents no matter the cost." Ethan nodded. "People will stand behind you, Malcolm. They have to." Sarah's face showed a touch of skepticism. "Not everyone will," she warned. "There are those in this town who will view you as a threat regardless. We need to be ready for a battle." Malcolm surveyed the crowd, then looked back at Sarah and Ethan. "I've been fighting my whole life," he said quietly. "I didn't come here to play it safe. We will expose Walker and the system he's part of, no matter what it takes." If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment number 3 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. That night, as Malcolm settled into the creaky old rocking chair on his front porch, the deepening twilight casting long shadows across his yard, a profound sense of unease settled over him. The fading light of day seemed to mirror the encroaching darkness of his thoughts. This town, which had initially greeted him with a veneer of civility masked by suspicion and hostility, now revealed a deeper, more sinister undercurrent. What had transpired earlier was not merely a personal affront directed at him. It symbolized a broader, more troubling issue. It was a stark reminder of every voice that had been silenced and every injustice that had been buried beneath layers of indifference and systemic corruption. As he sat there, lost in thought, his phone buzzed on the wooden table beside him. The screen lit up with a message from Sarah. Her text was brief but charged with determination. "I'll start drafting the complaint in the morning. We'll hit them where it hurts." Malcolm stared at the message, letting its words sink in. After a moment's contemplation, he typed back with steely resolve, "Thank you. Let's make sure this town never forgets." He set his phone down with a definitive click and leaned back in his chair, the cool evening breeze barely registering against the heat of his resolve. His mind raced through the battles ahead. He understood that this confrontation would not be swift or easy. It would be grueling, and it would test his endurance. Yet for the first time in a long while, he felt an unfamiliar but invigorating readiness. The ride back to the police station was enveloped in an oppressive silence. Malcolm, his wrists still stinging from the handcuffs, fixed his gaze forward, avoiding any direct eye contact. Travis Walker, the officer behind the wheel, exuded an unsettling mix of arrogance and satisfaction. From their first meeting, Walker had displayed a demeanor of condescension, but now his air of invincibility was more pronounced. It was as though he had convinced himself of his untouchability. When they arrived at the station, Walker's handling of Malcolm was deliberately rough, yanking him out of the car with a dismissive jerk. Malcolm gritted his teeth against the pain but refused to give Walker the satisfaction of seeing him flinch. Inside the station, Officer Myers awaited them, his face a canvas of discomfort and irritation. He cast a critical glance at Walker before shifting his gaze to Malcolm. "Walker, what the hell are you doing?" Myers demanded, his voice laced with frustration. Walker, unfazed, shrugged nonchalantly, still gripping Malcolm's arm with a firm grasp. "Just following protocol, Chief." There was a complaint I had to respond to. Simple as that. Myers' eyes narrowed as he looked at Malcolm, his unease deepening. "A complaint about the new judge. Are you out of your mind?" Malcolm, seizing the opportunity, stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. "This isn't about protocol, Chief Myers. This is about systemic racism that has been allowed to fester unchecked. I've been disrespected and humiliated not just as a judge, but as a black man, and it's because officers like Walker think they can operate with impunity." Myers sighed heavily, his fingers rubbing his temples to stave off the burgeoning headache. "Look, this is a misunderstanding. Walker, let him go." Walker's grip tightened momentarily before he begrudgingly released Malcolm's arm, stepping back with a scowl of dissatisfaction. Malcolm's voice dropped to a controlled, yet intense level. "This is more than a misunderstanding. It's a symptom of a deep-seated problem within your department. How many times have incidents like this been swept under the rug?" Walker's lips curled into a disdainful sneer as he crossed his arms. "You're making a mountain out of a molehill. One minor run-in and now you're hurling accusations." Malcolm slowly turned to face Walker, his tone sharp and unyielding. "This isn't just about this one incident. It's about every single run-in you've had, every person you've demeaned because of their skin color. It's about every injustice this department has systematically covered up." Myers, his voice strained but trying to maintain some semblance of authority, intervened. "Malcolm, we don't want this to escalate further. Walker was wrong in his approach, and I'll handle it. You have my word." Malcolm's eyes locked onto Myers with unwavering intensity. "Your word means little when your officers act like this. This isn't just about Walker. Your entire department needs to be held accountable." Walker opened his mouth to retort, but Myers silenced him with a piercing glare. "Enough. Walker, go to your desk." Walker hesitated, his simmering anger barely contained. "This isn't over," he muttered venomously, casting a last scathing look at Malcolm before storming off. Myers exhaled deeply, turning his attention back to Malcolm. "I understand your frustration, and it's justified, but let's try to keep this between us. I'll deal with it." Malcolm straightened in his chair, his voice resolute. "That's not an option. I'm filing a formal complaint, and I'll be involving Sarah Henderson, my attorney, to ensure this issue doesn't get buried." Myers' face paled slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Malcolm, do you want to provoke a full-scale conflict over this? Consider your position. The backlash from this town could turn very ugly very quickly." Malcolm's gaze remained steady, unblinking. "I'm not afraid of a fight, Chief. This isn't about me, it's about standing up for what's right." Back in his office, Chief Myers sat heavily behind his desk, feeling the immense weight of the unfolding situation pressing down on him. He could sense his career precariously balanced on the edge of collapse. For years, he had navigated the delicate balance between maintaining order and managing his officers, often by avoiding confrontation. But with Malcolm now in town and Walker's reckless behavior pushing boundaries, he knew a storm was inevitable. A knock on his office door jolted him from his thoughts. Walker stood in the doorway, his jaw clenched tightly. "You wanted to see me." Chief Walker's tone was taut, barely concealing his irritation. Myers gestured for him to sit, but Walker remained stubbornly upright. "Sit down," Myers commanded sharply. Walker reluctantly complied, folding his arms across his chest. "This situation with Robinson is a disaster." "Walker, what were you thinking?" Walker's expression grew defensive. "I was doing my job. Just because he's a judge doesn't mean he's above the law. He was acting suspiciously, and I responded accordingly." "What's the problem?" "The problem," Myers said, his voice rising in frustration, "is that you didn't follow proper protocol. You publicly humiliated a judge, and not just any judge, a black judge. Now he's filing a formal complaint. Do you grasp the implications for this department?" Walker shrugged dismissively. "So what? He's just one person. The town will support us." Myers slammed his hand down on the desk, causing Walker to flinch. "You're missing the point entirely. This isn't about local support. This is about legal accountability. If Robinson pursues this and it becomes public, we're all in trouble." Walker leaned in, his voice low and menacing. "You think I'm intimidated by him? Let him try. He doesn't understand this town like I do. He won't last. Myers shook his head in frustration. You're blind to the changing landscape. Times are evolving. People are watching, and they won't ignore this. Walker abruptly stood, his chair scraping noisily against the floor. Then let them watch. I'm not backing down. As Walker stormed out, Myers sank back into his chair, feeling the weight of his predicament. He knew Walker was out of line, but stopping him would be a monumental challenge. Walker had significant support from certain factions within the town, leaving Myers grappling with the realization that his efforts to maintain equilibrium were insufficient. Later that evening, Malcolm sat in his living room, the soft hum of his phone buzzing intermittently on the coffee table. Sarah's name flashed on the screen once more. What's the latest? Malcolm asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the mounting tension. I've filed the formal complaint with the department. Sarah's voice came through the phone, firm and resolute. But we both know that's just the beginning. Walker isn't going to back down, and Myers is caught in the middle, trying to preserve the peace while covering his interests. Malcolm exhaled, the sound heavy with resolve. So what's our next move? Sarah's response was unwavering. We take this to the public. We ensure that everyone knows what's happening within that department, every citizen, every media outlet. Walker won't be able to evade scrutiny. Malcolm hesitated for a moment. And the consequences? Sarah's tone softened with understanding. There will be repercussions. People will rally behind you, but others will view you as the adversary. You'll need to be prepared for that. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as if seeking answers from the shadows above. I've faced greater challenges before, Sarah. If this is the price of real change, then I'm prepared to pay it. Good, Sarah said with a tone of resolve, because we're gearing up for a battle. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment number 4 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. The following morning, Malcolm and Sarah stood outside the courthouse, their breath visible in the crisp air as the first media vans rolled in, disrupting the quiet of dawn. News of Malcolm's arrest had spread like wildfire, creating a media frenzy that descended upon the courthouse with relentless intensity. Reporters, eager to capture every nuance of the unfolding drama, surrounded the entrance, their cameras clicking and microphones thrust forward. Sarah took the lead, her voice steady and commanding as she faced the throng of journalists. With a tone that conveyed both urgency and resolve, she described the harrowing sequence of events that had led to Malcolm's arrest and laid out their determined plan to seek justice. Malcolm stood beside her, feeling the weight of the town's collective gaze pressing down on him. His eyes roamed the crowd, seeing the spectrum of reactions, some faces full of empathy and support, others shadowed with doubt and suspicion. The scrutiny was a heavy burden, yet he stood firm. This battle was no longer just about clearing his name. It was about challenging a system that had long thrived on silence and evaded accountability. It was a fight against an entrenched injustice that had gone unchallenged for far too long. As the day wore on, Malcolm found himself alone in his study, the soft hum of his computer the only sound breaking the silence. He stared intently at the viral video playing on his phone, the footage of his arrest that had exploded across social media. The video was more than just a recording. It was a stark, unforgiving lens on his reality. The comments beneath the video were a chaotic storm of outrage, disbelief, and disturbing racism. Each new notification felt like a fresh wound, a reminder of the fierce and often brutal scrutiny he was under. The court of public opinion had become a relentless battleground, where every word and image was dissected and debated. Just then, a knock on the door broke his reverie. Sarah walked in, her face set with an unyielding determination. There was no need for pleasantries. Her serious expression conveyed the gravity of the situation. Malcolm, she began, her voice resolute, we need to discuss our next steps. Malcolm placed his phone aside, the weight of the situation evident in his weary gaze. He gestured for Sarah to sit, his mind already racing through the possibilities. I know what you're going to say, Sarah, he said, his voice tinged with both resolve and exhaustion, but I'm not backing down. Sarah took her seat, her expression a blend of concern and steadfast support. That's not what I'm here to address, she said calmly. You know I'm fully behind you, but we need to be strategic about how we proceed. This case has evolved into something much larger than your struggle. It's become a flashpoint for wider issues. Malcolm leaned back, rubbing his temples as if trying to stave off the crushing pressure of the moment. A flashpoint is an understatement, he said, his voice a low murmur of frustration and fear. The entire town is on edge. Some are rallying around me while others. He paused, the unspoken tension hanging heavily in the air. "They're rallying behind Walker," Sarah finished for him, her voice grim. "The police are trying to downplay this as a simple misunderstanding," Malcolm said, his voice heavy with conviction. "But we know that this isn't just about one bad officer. It's about a systemic rot that has festered for years. If we continue to push for justice, that corrupt system will push back even harder." The gravity of his words seemed to fill the room, and Malcolm's voice dropped to a solemn whisper. "But we don't have any other choice, do we?" Sarah shook her head, her eyes reflecting the resolve she felt. "No, we don't. This has grown beyond just your battle. The community is looking to you to be the symbol of resistance, to prove that someone can fight back and make a difference." Malcolm met her gaze, the enormity of the responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. His voice was barely above a whisper, laden with uncertainty. "And if I lose?" "You won't," Sarah said firmly, her voice cutting through the uncertainty like a beacon. "We won't let that happen." Later, as the afternoon sun began to set, Malcolm found solace on the front porch with Ethan. They sat in companionable silence, the peaceful evening landscape providing a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding in their town. The serene view was a cruel reminder of the tumultuous storm that had engulfed their lives. Ethan broke the silence, his voice carrying a note of urgency. "They're organizing a protest tomorrow." Malcolm raised an eyebrow, the news adding another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming situation. "A protest? Who's behind it?" "Local activists," Ethan said. "And it looks like some students from the university are getting involved. They're planning to march down Main Street all the way to the courthouse." Malcolm exhaled deeply, the reality of the situation sinking in. "That's going to draw even more media attention," he said. "The spectacle will be unavoidable." "Which is exactly what we need," Ethan said, leaning forward with determination. "You know I've got your back, Malcolm. This town needs to see that change is coming, whether they're ready for it or not." "But it's not just the protesters we need to worry about," Malcolm said, his voice darkening with concern. "There are people here, people who support Walker, who are determined to keep things as they are. They'll fight back, and they won't be gentle." Ethan nodded, his expression serious but resolute. "I understand, but they can't halt what's already in motion. The more they try to suppress this movement, the more it will gain momentum." Malcolm stared out at the horizon, his thoughts racing. The fight for justice, once confined to the courtroom, had now spilled into the streets. It was no longer just about legal battles. It was a deeply personal struggle that engaged with the very essence of human hearts and minds. "I need to be at that protest tomorrow," Malcolm said quietly, his voice a mixture of determination and resolve. Ethan's face showed concern. "Are you sure that's wise? It could escalate." "I have to be there," Malcolm said firmly. "If I withdraw, it sends the wrong message. I need to stand with the people." Ethan considered his words for a moment, then nodded in agreement. "All right. If you're going, I'll be there with you." The following morning, the town of Grafton buzzed with a palpable tension. As dawn broke, so did the gathering of protesters, converging in clusters around the university, the town square, and the streets leading to the courthouse. The air was charged with the fervor of their cause, banners flapping in the breeze, each one proclaiming messages of justice and equality. The rhythmic hum of chanting voices grew louder, echoing the collective demand for change. Malcolm and Sarah walked side by side toward the courthouse, their steps resolute. Ethan joined them, his face set with unwavering determination. "Are you ready for this?" Sarah asked, her eyes searching Malcolm's. "As ready as I can be," Malcolm replied, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. As they neared the courthouse steps, the crowd parted to make way for Malcolm. Camera crews were already in place, their lenses poised to capture every moment. The energy in the air was electric, charged with the sense that this was a pivotal moment that could alter the town's future. Malcolm took his place at the podium, his gaze sweeping over the sea of faces. Some expressions were filled with hope and encouragement, while others conveyed skepticism or outright hostility. Yet he stood tall, refusing to be intimidated by the enormity of the moment. "Thank you all for being here," Malcolm began, his voice resonant and clear. "We are gathered here today not just to fight for my rights, but to stand up for every individual in this town who has ever been silenced, who has faced injustice, and who has been made to feel unwelcome." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices a powerful testament to the shared sense of purpose. Malcolm raised his hand to restore order. "This is not just my fight, it is our fight, and we will not be silent any longer." As Malcolm's impassioned words echoed through the square, the weight of the moment settled heavily upon him. The air was thick with anticipation, each breath laden with the gravity of what was unfolding. Just as the crowd's collective energy began to rise again, a disturbance emerged at the edge of the gathering, a palpable shift in the atmosphere. What started as a murmur quickly grew into a cacophony of angry shouts and frenzied movements. Malcolm's gaze swept toward the commotion and, through the growing chaos, he saw a group of counter-protesters pushing their way aggressively to the front. Their signs, starkly opposed to everything Malcolm stood for, cut through the air like daggers. Each slogan they held was a direct affront to the ideals Malcolm had tirelessly fought to promote. Sarah, standing close by, muttered under her breath, her voice tinged with a mixture of apprehension and resolve. "Here we go," she said, her eyes narrowing as the tension ratcheted up to a fever pitch. The unease in her voice was a mirror to Malcolm's own rising anxiety. As the counter-protesters closed in, their hostility was palpable, a raw, unfiltered manifestation of fear and resistance. One man, a hulking figure in a weathered cap, stepped forward with an air of aggression. His voice, booming and authoritative, sliced through the tumult. "This town doesn't need your kind of change," he roared, his words dripping with disdain. "You're trying to tear apart something that's been working just fine for generations. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment number 5 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me." The crowd around Malcolm tensed visibly, the atmosphere crackling with apprehension. Malcolm could feel the pressure mounting, an almost physical force pushing against him. The moment was fraught with a heavy sense of impending conflict. Despite the escalating hostility, Malcolm chose not to engage in a tit-for-tat shouting match. Instead, he drew upon every ounce of inner strength he had, raising his voice above the din with a calm yet unwavering resolve. "This isn't about tearing anything apart," Malcolm declared, his tone steady and resolute. "It's about building something better for everyone. It's about ensuring that every single person in this town is treated with fairness, dignity, and respect. And if that's something you can't stand for, then it's you who doesn't belong here." As his words rang out, the crowd responded with a powerful roar of approval. The sheer force of their collective voice began to drown out the counter-protesters. The man in the cap tried to retort, but his words were swallowed by the overwhelming support Malcolm received. The man's expression shifted from defiance to realization as he slowly backed away. Understanding that the tide had irrevocably turned, Malcolm turned back to face the cheering crowd, his heart pounding fiercely in his chest. Though victorious at this moment, he was acutely aware that the struggle was far from over. Later that evening, Malcolm sat in the quiet of his living room with Sarah and Ethan, the adrenaline of the day still surging through his veins. The room was filled with a tense silence, broken only by Sarah's words, which were laden with concern. "That was close," Sarah said, her voice a mixture of relief and worry. "If things had escalated any further." "But they didn't," Ethan interjected, his tone firm and reassuring. "And that's because people saw who you are, Malcolm. They saw your determination and your refusal to back down, and it inspired them to stand firm with you." Malcolm nodded, the weight of their words settling over him like a heavy cloak. "Today was a victory," he said slowly, the gravity of the day's events reflected in his voice. "But there's still a long, challenging road ahead." Sarah managed a faint smile, a beacon of encouragement amidst the uncertainty. "One step at a time, Malcolm, one step at a time." As the night stretched on, Malcolm understood that this was merely the beginning of a long journey. The town of Grafton was in the throes of transformation, and while there would be many more battles to fight, a flicker of hope had begun to ignite within him. For the first time in a long while, he felt that they were making tangible progress, pushing back against the encroaching darkness and inching closer to a more hopeful future. Standing by the window of his modest home, Malcolm gazed out at the scene unfolding on the streets below. The growing crowd of protesters, their signs bearing powerful slogans like "Justice for All" and "End Racism Now," created a striking contrast to the quiet town of Grafton, which had always remained under the national radar. The town was now thrust into the spotlight, and the eyes of the entire country were fixed upon them. Sarah, seated on the couch behind him, flipped through the stack of paperwork they had been buried in for hours. Her voice broke the silence, tinged with a mix of astonishment and concern. "This case is blowing up faster than I ever expected," she said, her words reflecting the gravity of their situation. "We're receiving calls from civil rights organizations, journalists, even politicians. Everyone is eager to know what's next." Malcolm turned, his face etched with exhaustion but also a fierce determination. "It's more than just the case now, Sarah," he said, his voice laden with emotion. "This has evolved into a fight for the soul of this town." Sarah nodded, her concern deepening. "And this fight is turning ugly. There's talk of people coming from outside to join the protests. Grafton has never experienced anything like this. It's becoming dangerous." "I know," Malcolm said, rubbing his neck with a mixture of frustration and resolve, "but retreating is not an option." The raised voices outside interrupted their conversation. Malcolm stepped out onto the porch, his eyes scanning the scene. Across the street, a group of counter-protesters had gathered, their signs in support of Travis Walker and the police. Their chants were a harsh, venomous counterpoint to the calls for justice. "Go back to where you came from," one man shouted, his anger directed at Malcolm's house. "You're tearing this town apart," a woman yelled, her face flushed with rage. Malcolm's jaw tightened as he watched the vitriol being hurled at him. He knew that change was often met with fear and resistance, but the raw hatred on display was a bitter pill to swallow. "Ignore them," Sarah said, joining him on the porch and standing by his side. "They're loud, but they don't represent the majority." "I wish I could believe that," Malcolm replied, his voice heavy with doubt. "This town, it's divided in ways I didn't fully understand until now." The next morning, Malcolm was summoned to an emergency meeting with Mayor Jim Fitzgerald. As Malcolm entered the town hall, the mayor, a man in his late 50s with thinning hair and a permanently furrowed brow, greeted him with a somber expression. "Malcolm," Mayor Fitzgerald began, motioning for him to sit. "We need to talk." Malcolm took his seat, his posture calm yet bristling with alertness. "I'm listening." The mayor's sigh was a heavy release of accumulated stress. "This situation is escalating, the protests, the media frenzy. It's more than this town can bear. We need to find a way to de-escalate before things spiral out of control." "You mean you want me to back down?" Malcolm asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and determination. Fitzgerald winced but did not deny the implication. "Look, I understand that what happened to you was wrong, but this town is delicate, and if we keep pushing, it's going to break. People are scared, businesses are contemplating leaving. We can't afford this kind of disruption." Malcolm leaned forward, his eyes sharp with intensity. "So what exactly are you asking me to do? Let Walker off the hook? Allow the police department to continue its unjust practices?" "I'm asking you to consider the bigger picture," the mayor replied, his voice tinged with desperation. "We need a compromise. We can't let this town be destroyed over one incident." "It's not just one incident," Malcolm shot back, his voice fierce. "It's a recurring pattern of injustice. If we sweep this under the rug, it will continue. That's the broader picture." The mayor rubbed his temples, his frustration palpable. "You're not giving me much to work with here, Malcolm. Maybe it's because I'm utterly exhausted by the endless string of compromises that always leave people like me with nothing," Malcolm said, his voice steady but imbued with a fierce resolve. "This town has been mired in a cycle of half measures and concessions for far too long, and it's always the most vulnerable who end up suffering the most. Each time they offer a token gesture of change, it's never enough. It's just a bandage over a festering wound. And now, it's those who have the least power who are forced to bear the brunt of these broken promises." The mayor was silent for what felt like an eternity, his face a mask of contemplation. Finally, he nodded slowly, the weight of Malcolm's words resonating with him. "I just hope you understand the full gravity of what you're stepping into," the mayor said, his voice tinged with a mix of caution and reluctant respect. That evening, Malcolm sat in his dimly lit living room with Ethan, the shadows reflecting the heaviness of the day. The room felt oppressively quiet, the weight of Malcolm's words and actions hanging in the air. Ethan, ever the pragmatist, had a beer in hand, attempting to ease the tension with his usual attempt at levity. "You know, for someone who just took the mayor to task, you don't look all that triumphant," Ethan remarked, his attempt at humor falling flat as his concern shone through. Malcolm shook his head, the fatigue of the day etched into his features. "This isn't a victory," he replied, his voice carrying a profound sense of weariness. Ethan took a long sip of his drink, his gaze lingering on Malcolm with a mix of sympathy and apprehension. "The town is on the brink of something incredibly dangerous, and I feel like we're teetering on the edge with no clear path to pull it back." Malcolm exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of his responsibilities crashing down on him. "People are notoriously resistant to change, especially in a place like Grafton. The resistance you've sparked has unearthed deep-seated truths. But the road ahead is fraught with challenges. Yet the fact that we forced this community to confront its reflection, no matter how brutal that reflection might be, is a significant achievement. "I'm not sure that's enough," Malcolm admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "The divisions are becoming sharper, and the stakes are growing higher. Each day the conflict escalates, and it feels like we're only inching closer to a breaking point." Ethan leaned forward, his voice steady and filled with encouragement. "Nobody thought this would be easy, but you're doing the right thing. The people who truly matter, who understand what's at stake, they'll stand by you." Malcolm met Ethan's gaze, feeling a surge of appreciation for his friend's unwavering support. "I hope you're right." Just then, a sharp, insistent knock on the door shattered the fragile calm of the moment. Malcolm opened it to find Sarah standing there, her face drawn tight with urgency and worry. "Malcolm, we need to go." "Something's happened," Sarah said, her voice urgent and commanding. Sarah drove them swiftly through the darkening streets to the town square, where earlier in the evening, a group of protesters had gathered. As they arrived, the scene was one of overwhelming chaos. The air was thick with palpable tension, and police officers were scattered throughout, their faces etched with grim determination. "What's happened?" Malcolm demanded as they stepped out of the car, his voice filled with concern. "There was a confrontation," Sarah explained, her tone heavy with concern. "Some counter-protesters showed up, and things quickly spiraled out of control." Now she trailed off as they approached the epicenter of the turmoil. "If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment number 6 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me." In the heart of the square, a young black man, one of the protesters, was being roughly handcuffed by the police. His face was a mask of blood and bruises, and he looked disoriented and defeated as the officers manhandled him into a squad car. "Stop!" Malcolm shouted, his voice cutting through the din of the crowd. The officers turned, their expressions a mix of surprise and irritation at his sudden presence. Officer Daniels stepped forward, his demeanor brusque. "This is not your concern, Judge Robinson. We're handling the situation," Daniels said curtly. "It is my concern," Malcolm retorted, stepping closer despite the growing hostility. "What exactly happened here?" "This individual became violent," Daniels stated flatly, his eyes devoid of empathy. "We had no choice but to subdue him." Sarah's eyes flashed with anger. "He's half your size. Look at him, he's barely conscious. This isn't about justice, it's about brute force." The tension in the square reached a fever pitch as more protesters gathered, their faces a storm of fear and outrage. Malcolm's heart pounded in his chest, the gravity of the moment pressing heavily upon him. "This is exactly why we're out here," Malcolm said, his voice rising with passionate defiance. "You're using excessive force to silence dissent, but that won't work. We will not be intimidated into silence." Daniel's expression hardened, but he remained silent, opting to motion for the officers to continue their actions. As the squad car drove away, Malcolm turned to Sarah, his fist clenched in anger and frustration. "This situation is spiraling out of control." "It's been out of control," Sarah replied, her voice a mix of resolve and exhaustion. "But we have to keep pushing forward. We have to keep fighting." Malcolm nodded, a profound sense of dread settling in his chest. The lines of battle were clearer than ever, and the future was shrouded in uncertainty. But one thing was unmistakable: the struggle was far from over. The courtroom was packed to capacity, with every seat filled and those unable to find a place standing along the walls, their anticipation palpable. Malcolm sat at the front, his hands clasped firmly on the table before him, calm yet intensely focused. Across the aisle sat Travis Walker, his expression a blend of smug arrogance and nervous tension. Sarah leaned in, her voice a hushed whisper of reassurance. "Everything is in place. The witnesses are ready, and we've got all the necessary records. This is the day we've been waiting for." Malcolm nodded, his mind racing through the arduous journey that had brought them to this pivotal moment, from the initial arrest that sparked the protests to the threats and challenges they had faced. He glanced over at Ethan, who sat in the gallery, offering him a reassuring nod. They were ready. The judge entered the room, and everyone rose in unison. "Be seated," the judge commanded, his voice stern and authoritative. "We're here today to address serious allegations of misconduct by Officer Travis Walker, as well as to examine claims of systemic issues within the Grafton Police Department." As the proceedings began, Sarah launched into a powerful opening argument, laying out the case against Walker and the department with unwavering conviction. Your Honor, what we're dealing with here is not merely an isolated instance of racial profiling. This is part of a deeply entrenched pattern that has persisted unchecked for years, she declared, presenting a compelling array of evidence detailing numerous complaints against Walker, some dating back over a decade. These are not mere accidents or isolated events. These are deliberate actions by an officer who believed himself untouchable, shielded by a system designed to protect him from any real accountability. Walker's lawyer, an older gentleman exuding a meticulously polished demeanor, rose to counter the claims with a calm but firm resolve. Your Honor, we firmly reject the notion that Officer Walker acted with any racial intent. My client was merely performing his duties, responding to what he perceived as a suspicious situation. There is no discernible pattern of misconduct here, only a dedicated officer striving to maintain order and ensure public safety. Malcolm felt his fists clenching involuntarily beneath the table. The defense was attempting to downplay the situation, insinuating that it was merely a figment of his imagination. But Malcolm was resolute. The truth was on his side, and today it would be laid bare. The court session proceeded with the first witness being called to the stand, Denise Turner, a middle-aged black woman who had filed a formal complaint against Officer Walker 2 years prior. Her presence alone was a testament to the gravity of the case. Ms. Turner Sarah began with a tone of professional yet empathetic inquiry. Could you please describe the incident that led to your complaint against Officer Walker? Denise nodded, her voice steady but laced with deep emotion. I was walking home from work late one evening. As I passed Officer Walker, who was patrolling the area, he abruptly pulled his car over and demanded to know where I was headed, even though I had done nothing wrong. Sarah prompted, and what occurred after that? Denise took a deep breath, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and frustration. He ordered me to place my hands on the hood of his car. When I asked why, he told me I looked out of place in the neighborhood. I've lived in Grafton my entire life. She paused, her voice quivering. He proceeded to search me and subjected me to humiliation in the middle of the street, all because I'm black. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs of shock and disbelief, and Malcolm felt the weight of Denise's testimony resonate deeply. This was precisely what he had been fighting to reveal. Turning to the judge, Sarah stated, Your Honor, this incident is not an isolated case. There have been numerous similar complaints against Officer Walker. Despite these grievances, the department took no action, allowing Walker to continue his patrols without facing any repercussions. The defense lawyer rose, eager to discredit Denise's testimony. Ms. Turner, is it possible that you may have misunderstood Officer Walker's intentions? After all, his role is to ensure the safety of the community. Denise's gaze was unwavering as she responded, I know exactly what happened. It wasn't about safety. It was about exerting power. The next witness was Officer John Ruiz, a fellow officer who had worked alongside Walker for several years. Sarah had exerted considerable effort to secure his testimony, and his appearance was a crucial development in the case. Officer Ruiz, Sarah began, You've had substantial experience working with Officer Walker. Can you describe your observations and experiences with him? Ruiz shifted uneasily but nodded in acknowledgement. I've witnessed behaviors that concern me. Walker has a pattern of targeting certain individuals, primarily black or Latino individuals. He stops them more frequently and treats them differently. Have you ever reported this behavior? Sarah inquired. Ruiz hesitated before answering. No, it's challenging to confront a fellow officer. But after witnessing what happened to Judge Robinson, I couldn't remain silent any longer. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence, the air thick with tension. Ruiz's testimony provided damning internal confirmation of Walker's misconduct. The defense lawyer seized the opportunity to cast doubt. Officer Ruiz, you've worked with Walker for many years. Isn't it true that you've never filed a formal complaint against him until now? Why choose to speak up only in light of this high-profile case? Ruiz swallowed hard, glancing at Malcolm before responding. Because I was afraid, we all were. But it's time the truth is revealed. As the trial progressed, Sarah meticulously presented a comprehensive pattern of Walker's misconduct, supported by credible witnesses and documented complaints. The defense struggled to counteract the overwhelming evidence. Finally, it was Malcolm's turn to take the stand. Judge Robinson, Sarah began with a calm and measured tone. Can you recount the events of the day of your arrest? Malcolm recounted the events with clarity, the humiliation of the experience still vivid. From the moment Officer Walker laid eyes on me, I was treated as a criminal. He disregarded who I was or what I had to say. All he saw was a black man, and that alone seemed to justify his actions. The defense lawyer tried to undermine Malcolm's testimony, but he maintained his composure, addressing each challenge with unwavering honesty. So Judge Robinson, the defense lawyer, pressed, "You believe this entire situation stems from systemic racism?" "I don't just believe it," Malcolm replied with conviction. "I know it. And I believe that today this court will see the truth." The closing arguments were charged with intensity. Sarah delivered her final plea with the same passion and precision that had characterized her presentation throughout the trial. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment number 7 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. This case is not solely about Officer Walker, she asserted. It's about a systemic issue that allowed him to act with impunity. It's about the residents of Grafton who have been marginalized and mistreated for too long. This trial represents justice for Malcolm Robinson, for Denise Turner, and for every person who has been made to feel as though they do not belong. The time for change is now. The defense clung to their narrative of Walker as a misunderstood officer trying to navigate a complex situation, but the jury's expressions revealed their understanding they had witnessed enough. After hours of tense deliberation, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew thick with anticipation. Finally, the judge's voice sliced through the silence, authoritative and clear. "We find the defendant, Officer Travis Walker, guilty of misconduct." The announcement was met with a collective sigh of relief from the packed courtroom. Malcolm felt the crushing weight of the battle lift slightly from his shoulders. It wasn't a complete resolution, but it was a crucial victory. Sarah turned to him, her face breaking into a rare, triumphant smile. "We did it." "Ah." Malcolm nodded, feeling a complex mix of relief and the ever-present weight of ongoing challenges. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel a sliver of hope for Grafton's future. As the courtroom began to clear, Ethan approached, giving Malcolm a hearty pat on the back. "You've changed this town, Malcolm, for the better." Malcolm returned the smile, though exhaustion was etched into his features. "We all have, Ethan. This is just the beginning." The courtroom buzzed with renewed energy as the proceedings continued. Officer O'Connell took the stand, his voice steady but betraying a hint of nervousness. Sarah wasted no time in her questioning. "Officer O'Connell, how long have you worked alongside Officer Walker?" "About 15 years, O'Connell responded, his eyes briefly darting toward Walker before returning to Sarah. "And in those 15 years," Sarah pressed, "have you ever observed Officer Walker engaging in any behavior that could be considered misconduct?" O'Connell shifted uncomfortably, the tension in his posture evident. After a moment of hesitation, he finally spoke. "Yes, there were several incidents where Walker crossed the line." A murmur of shock rippled through the courtroom, but Sarah remained composed. "Can you elaborate on these incidents?" O'Connell's voice grew softer as he continued. "There were occasions when Walker stopped individuals, predominantly Black or Latino residents, without just cause. He'd accuse them of various offenses they hadn't committed and use intimidation tactics." He paused, the weight of his confession apparent. "I should have spoken up sooner, but it's difficult to stand against one of your own." Sarah pressed further. "Are you suggesting that Officer Walker's actions were not isolated incidents, but rather part of a recurring pattern of targeting individuals based on their race?" O'Connell nodded gravely. "That's correct." Malcolm's heart pounded with a mix of anxiety and hope. This testimony was crucial. It provided the confirmation they needed that Walker's misconduct was part of a broader, systemic issue rather than a mere lapse in judgment. The defense attorney was quick to rise for cross-examination. "Isn't it true that you never filed any formal complaints about Officer Walker? Why bring this up now?" O'Connell's face was drawn and his voice steady but resolute. "Because I can't remain silent any longer. What Walker has been doing is wrong, and people need to know the truth." As O'Connell stepped down, the tension in the courtroom was almost palpable. The next witness, Jerome Hayes, was called to the stand. Jerome had filed a complaint against Walker years earlier, but his grievance had been ignored. His testimony was crucial in illustrating how the system had failed to address Walker's behavior. Sarah approached Jerome with a reassuring demeanor. "Mr. Hayes, can you recount your experience with Officer Walker?" Jerome took a deep breath, his nerves evident but his determination clear. "About 4 years ago, I was driving home late at night when Walker pulled me over. He claimed my tail light was out, but when I checked, it was perfectly fine. He told me to step out of the car and said I was acting suspiciously." Sarah's voice was gentle. "And were you acting suspiciously?" Jerome shook his head. "No, I was just trying to get home." But he made me stand there with my hands on the hood of my car while he searched through it. And did he find anything? Sarah asked. No, Jerome said, his voice heavy with remembered humiliation. He kept me there for over an hour, treating me like a criminal. It was degrading. Sarah's expression was one of quiet empathy. Did you file a complaint after the incident? I did, Jerome replied. But nothing came of it. They said there wasn't enough evidence. The courtroom fell silent, the gravity of Jerome's words hanging in the air. This wasn't merely about Walker's actions. It was about a system that had perpetually failed to address and rectify systemic abuses. Sarah nodded in acknowledgement. Thank you, Mr. Hayes. No further questions. Despite the defense's attempts to discredit him, Jerome remained steadfast. Walker treated me like a criminal because of the color of my skin. That's the reality of it. The culmination of the day's testimony arrived when Sarah presented the final piece of evidence, a collection of internal emails exchanged between senior officers, including Chief Myers. These emails revealed that complaints against Walker had been documented but intentionally ignored to protect Walker's reputation and preserve the department's image. Sarah held up the emails for the court to see, her voice filled with righteous indignation. These emails are proof that the issue was not limited to one officer's misconduct. The entire department was complicit in covering it up. The impact of the evidence was immediate and powerful, a damning indictment of both Walker's actions and the systemic corruption that had shielded him. The courtroom buzzed with the weight of the revelations, a mixture of outrage and realization settling over everyone present. The courtroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of whispers and murmurs, each conversation layered with disbelief and the weight of the day's revelations. The gravity of what had just transpired sank deep into the consciousness of everyone present. Malcolm felt an intense, almost visceral surge of emotions, a potent mix of anger at the rampant corruption that had been unearthed and a profound relief that the truth was no longer hidden. The judge's attempts to restore order seemed almost laughable in the face of the palpable excitement and agitation that filled the room. It was clear to everyone that this case had evolved beyond a matter of individual misconduct. It had transformed into a sweeping indictment of the entire police department, a far-reaching condemnation of a flawed system. As the trial drew to a close, the defense made a final, desperate attempt to salvage Officer Walker's case. They argued that the incriminating emails, while damning, did not directly link Walker to any illegal activity, but their efforts felt hollow and too little, too late. The jury had been confronted with an overwhelming amount of evidence, and their decision seemed inevitable. When the judge announced that the jury would reconvene the following day to deliver their verdict, Malcolm exhaled deeply, the exhaustion of the prolonged battle weighing heavily on him. Sarah, ever the steadying force, gave him a look of reassurance. We've done everything we can, she said, her voice steady but soft. Now it's up to them. That evening, Malcolm, Sarah, and Ethan gathered in Malcolm's living room, each reflecting on the enormity of the day's events. The room was a cocoon of exhaustion and anticipation, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on them. Ethan broke the silence with a sober observation. This isn't just about Walker anymore, he said, his tone grave and reflective. It's the entire system that's on trial here. Exactly, Sarah replied, her voice carrying a note of resolute conviction. We always knew this case was bigger than just one officer, but now the entire town understands that too. Malcolm nodded, though he couldn't shake the heaviness that seemed to cling to his chest. Even if Walker is convicted, this fight is far from over, he said, his voice tinged with weariness. The police department needs a comprehensive overhaul, and there are still many people in this town who won't accept the truth, no matter how glaring it is. Ethan leaned forward, his eyes blazing with determination. They don't have a choice, Malcolm. The truth is out now. They can't ignore what's been exposed. Sarah's agreement was a small comfort amidst the uncertainty. Tomorrow, when the jury comes back, we'll see where this town stands. The next morning, the courtroom was once again packed to capacity. The air was charged with tension, each person present feeling the weight of the moment. Malcolm stood before the gallery, his hands clasped tightly together, as the jury filed back into the room. His heart raced, each beat echoing the significance of what was about to unfold. The foreman rose, holding a piece of paper that seemed to carry the collective weight of the courtroom's anticipation, and the room fell into a profound, expectant silence. We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Travis Walker, guilty on all counts. A collective gasp swept through the crowd, a wave of mixed emotions that rippled through the room: shock, relief, and a burgeoning sense of vindication. Malcolm felt an intense rush of feelings, relief that justice had been served, vindication that their efforts had not been in vain, and an overwhelming realization that this was merely the beginning of a much larger struggle. Walker's face went ashen, his previously assured demeanor shattered, while his lawyer slumped in defeat. The judge's formalities and expressions of gratitude towards the jury seemed almost insignificant as the room buzzed with conversation, the verdict's impact still sinking in. Turning to Sarah and Ethan, Malcolm managed a small, weary smile, his exhaustion evident. "We did it," he said, his voice carrying a mix of relief and a lingering sense of unfulfilled resolution. Sarah's smile, though faint, was filled with an understanding depth. "We did, but now the real work begins." As Malcolm stepped outside, the evening sun cast a golden hue over the town, transforming it into a canvas of soft light and long shadows. The street was alive with clusters of people discussing the trial and its repercussions. For some, this was a hard-won victory. For others, it marked the beginning of an uncertain journey. "Malcolm," Sarah called out as she caught up with him on the courthouse steps. Her face was etched with exhaustion but illuminated with a glimmer of satisfaction. "We did it." "Did it." Malcolm's smile was faint, the lines of weariness still apparent. "It's a step in the right direction," he said, his voice reflecting the ongoing challenge. "But this town, it's going to take more than one verdict to mend what's been broken." Sarah nodded, her expression growing serious as she considered the long road ahead. "I know, but today was about accountability. It's something this town hasn't seen in a long time. You made that happen." Before Malcolm could respond, Ethan emerged from the crowd, pushing through the gathering with a sense of purpose. His typically laid-back demeanor was replaced by a fiery intensity. "Malcolm, you're a damn hero. You know that." Malcolm shook his head, a gesture of modesty masking his deep fatigue. "Hero? I'm just trying to fix something that's been broken for a long time." Ethan clapped Malcolm on the shoulder with a sense of camaraderie and admiration, and that's exactly what heroes do. "Look around, man. You've started something important here." If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment number 8 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. As Malcolm looked out over the crowd, the scene before him was a striking reflection of the town's fractured state. Faces turned towards him with expressions of unwavering support, their nods and smiles conveying a profound sense of solidarity. These were people, many of them strangers, who seemed to embrace his struggle as their own, their encouragement offering a glimmer of hope amid the tumult. Yet, juxtaposed against these encouraging faces were others twisted in resentment, some with their backs turned, unable or unwilling to confront the implications of what had just transpired. The divide in the town was more pronounced than ever, a stark illustration of the rift that the trial had laid bare. "I just hope it's enough," Malcolm murmured, his voice barely audible, a quiet reflection of his inner turmoil. Later that evening, Malcolm returned to his modest home, the weight of the day still heavy on his shoulders. The house was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the cacophony of voices and emotions that had defined the day. He sank onto the edge of his couch, his gaze fixed on the stack of papers on the coffee table, the trial documents, the complaints, the evidence that had contributed to Travis Walker's conviction. The trial might have concluded, but Malcolm knew that the real work was only beginning. The promised reforms for the police department would inevitably face resistance. The town was starkly divided. Many still clung to the belief that Walker had merely been performing his duties, while others were fervently calling for deeper, systemic changes. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Ethan, bearing 2 bottles of beer and a wide grin. "Thought you might need one of these," Ethan said, handing Malcolm a bottle as he stepped inside. Malcolm managed a faint smile, accepting the drink. "Thanks, but I'm not sure a beer will cut through the weight of today." Ethan settled onto the couch, opening his bottle with a practiced flick. "You're too hard on yourself. In the past few months, you've accomplished more than most people do in their entire lives. The reforms are coming, whether the old guard likes it or not." "But will they endure?" Malcolm asked, leaning forward with a troubled expression. "The town is split right down the middle. Half still believes Walker was justified in his actions." Ethan sighed, taking a thoughtful sip. "Yes, that's true, but the other half, they're ready for change. That's a significant shift from where we started." Malcolm acknowledged the truth in Ethan's words. The protests, the support from civil rights groups, the media attention, each had played a role in building momentum. Yet a lingering fear gnawed at him, the potential backlash, the hostility from those who felt their way of life was under threat. "You're worried about the threats, aren't you?" Ethan asked, perceptively reading the tension etched on Malcolm's face. Malcolm nodded, his expression somber. "I've already received a few threats since the trial began, anonymous letters, phone calls. Nothing concrete, but enough to make me wary." Ethan's demeanor shifted from casual to serious. "You've got to be careful, Malcolm. Some of these people won't just walk away." "I know," Malcolm said quietly, his resolve unwavering despite his apprehension. "But if I back down now, everything we fought for will unravel." Ethan was silent for a moment, then nodded with a firm, supportive conviction. "You're right. And I'm with you, no matter what happens." The following morning, Malcolm woke early, the first light of dawn barely touching the horizon. He felt a peculiar mix of calm and trepidation, knowing that while the hardest battles might be behind him, the challenges ahead would be equally formidable. As he prepared for the day, his phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "The mayor's calling for a town meeting to address the reforms. It's happening today at noon. You should be there." Malcolm stared at the message, feeling a familiar churn of anxiety in his stomach. A town meeting meant confronting the people, facing their anger and fears, and trying to persuade them that change was not something to be feared. He texted back, "I'll be there." When Malcolm arrived at the town hall, the scene was a microcosm of the town's tension. The hall was packed to capacity, every seat occupied, with additional people standing along the walls, their eyes fixed on the small stage where the mayor, Malcolm, and other community leaders stood. Mayor Fitzgerald approached the podium, his expression a careful blend of neutrality and strain. It was clear that this would not be an easy task. "Ladies and gentlemen," the mayor began, his voice striving to carry over the growing murmur of the crowd. "We're here today to discuss the reforms that will be implemented following the trial. The police department will undergo a comprehensive review, and measures will be introduced to ensure greater accountability and transfer forward." A smattering of applause emerged from the audience, but it was quickly overshadowed by a louder, more vociferous murmur of discontent. A man stood up, his face flushed with anger. "These so-called reforms are nothing more than an attack on our way of life. You're punishing honorable men for merely doing their jobs." The room erupted into a cacophony of shouting and clapping. The divide Malcolm had feared now laid bare before his eyes. Mayor Fitzgerald, standing at the center of the chaos, raised his hands in a desperate attempt to restore order. "Please, everyone, let's keep this civil," he implored, his voice strained under the weight of the rising anger. The atmosphere was charged with raw emotion, and Malcolm could feel the palpable tension in the air. He knew he had to address the crowd, despite the turmoil, to convey the essence of his message. With a deep breath, Malcolm stepped up to the podium. The room gradually quieted, the clamor subsiding as all eyes turned to him. His voice, steady and resolute, cut through the remnants of the uproar. "I understand that there are those among us who fear change," Malcolm began, his tone firm yet compassionate. "But this isn't about assigning blame or punishing anyone. It's about ensuring that every individual in our community, regardless of their background, is treated with the fairness and respect they deserve." His words hung in the air, seeking to bridge the gap between conflicting perspectives. There were murmurs among the crowd, but this time they carried a note of tentative agreement. Malcolm continued, "We cannot continue to pretend that what happened with Officer Walker was an isolated incident. It is a symptom of a larger, systemic issue, one that we must confront directly if we are to achieve true justice." The crowd listened intently. Though the tension remained thick and almost palpable, Malcolm took another deep breath, meeting the gazes of those present, his resolve unwavering. "I didn't come here to sow discord. I came because I believe in justice, and I have faith that this town can become a better place for everyone." As he concluded his speech, the reactions continued to fluctuate, a testament to the deep divisions within the town. Malcolm left the meeting with a sense of accomplishment tempered by the uncertainty of the road ahead, knowing that despite the progress made, many challenges still lay in wait. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Then, slowly, a few individuals began to clap, their applause tentative but growing in strength. Though it wasn't universal, it was enough to reassure Malcolm that his efforts were not in vain. Later, as the meeting drew to a close, Sarah found Malcolm standing near the exit. She approached him with a look of admiration. "You handled that perfectly," she said, her voice warm and sincere. Malcolm offered a weary but genuine smile. "It's not over yet," he replied, "but maybe, just maybe, we're beginning to make some progress." Sarah's eyes reflected a cautious optimism. "One step at a time, Malcolm. One step at a time." Weeks had passed since the trial, and Grafton was still grappling with its new reality. Reforms within the police department had been initiated, but the changes were gradual and met with resistance. The town was visibly divided, with some residents embracing the reforms as a necessary and overdue change, while others perceived them as a threat to their way of life. Malcolm stood on his porch, looking out at the quiet street. A street that had once felt foreign and unwelcoming now carried a deeper significance. The battle he had fought wasn't just for personal vindication, it was a fight to transform a system. Yet the victory had come with its own set of challenges. Malcolm could feel the weight of every skeptical glance from his neighbors, every whispered conversation that followed him through the stores. But there was also a grudging respect from those who had witnessed the truth emerge from the shadows. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment number 8 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. As Malcolm stood lost in thought, Sarah's car pulled up, and she stepped out holding a folder. With a determined stride and a faint smile, she walked up the steps to join him. "You seem deep in thought," she said, handing him the folder. "I was reflecting on how far we've come," Malcolm replied, taking the folder and flipping it open. "But there's still so much further to go." Sarah leaned against the porch railing, her gaze steady. "The reforms are underway, Malcolm. They're slow, but they're happening. The department is being forced to confront its failings, and people are beginning to hold them accountable. You played a crucial role in making that happen." Malcolm glanced over the documents, reports on new training programs for police officers, the establishment of civilian oversight committees, and a community outreach initiative. "It's a start," he said, closing the folder. "But changing the mindset of those who still view Walker as a hero will take time." Sarah's voice was calm but resolute. "The seeds of change are already planted. People are discussing issues that were previously ignored, and you're a significant part of why that's happening." Malcolm offered a faint smile. "You give me too much credit. None of this would have been possible without you and Ethan pushing alongside me." "Perhaps," Sarah said, "but you're the one who stood up when it mattered most." Don't forget that later that afternoon, Malcolm met Ethan at a local cafe. They sat at an outdoor table, the crisp autumn air a refreshing contrast to the heated debates of recent weeks. The town seemed to be taking a collective breath, almost as if it were pausing to reflect on the storm that had swept through its core. Ethan stirred his coffee, breaking the silence. "What's next for Malcolm Robinson?" Malcolm chuckled softly. "That's the big question, isn't it?" Ethan looked thoughtful. "You've already accomplished so much, but I sense you're not one to just rest on your laurels." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, surveying the street with a contemplative gaze. "I came here with the hope of making a difference in the justice system, of bringing some fresh air to this town. And in a way I did. But I've learned that real change isn't something you can achieve with just one case or one verdict." Ethan nodded, his expression reflective. "It's like we're trying to turn a tide that's been pulling in the wrong direction for so long. It feels almost impossible to shift." Malcolm agreed. "Exactly. But we can't stop fighting. Not now. I've been considering getting more involved in the community, working with the youth, and perhaps starting programs aimed at preventing the systemic issues we've been confronting." Ethan grinned widely, a spark of enthusiasm in his eyes. "That sounds exactly like what this town needs. You're not just aiming to make changes from the bench, you're tackling it from the ground up, which is where real transformation begins." "That's the plan," Malcolm agreed, feeling a renewed sense of purpose settle over him. The enormity of the challenge was becoming clearer with each passing day, but there was a determination to confront it head-on. "But it's going to be a long and arduous road." Ethan raised his coffee cup in a mock toast, his smile widening with encouragement. "Well, I'll be right there with you every step of the way. Here's to the long road ahead and to making a real difference." Malcolm chuckled, lifting his cup to clink against Ethan's. "Here's to it." Later that evening, as Malcolm unwound at home, his phone rang with a call from Mayor Fitzgerald. The mayor had been relatively quiet since the trial, maneuvering through the political fallout of the recent reforms. However, this call had a different tone, one that suggested a new development. "Malcolm," the mayor's voice came through, slightly strained but earnest. "I wanted to check in and see how you're holding up." "I'm doing fine, Jim," Malcolm replied, his tone cautious yet open. "What's on your mind?" The mayor paused, as if weighing his words carefully. "I've been reflecting on the direction our town is heading. There's still a lot of anger and division out there, but I believe there's also a genuine opportunity to start healing. I was wondering if you'd be open to collaborating on some community initiatives, things that could help bridge the gap between the different factions." Malcolm took a moment to consider the offer, feeling a mixture of skepticism and cautious optimism. "What kind of initiatives are you thinking about?" The mayor outlined his proposal with a sense of urgency. Workshops aimed at fostering dialogue between the police and the community, youth programs designed to engage and educate, and other initiatives that could promote understanding and unity. I recognize that we haven't always agreed, but I think if we join forces, we might be able to affect real change. Malcolm appreciated the mayor's shift in tone, though he remained wary of any potential superficiality. "I'll think about it, Jim," he said firmly. "But if we're going to proceed, it has to be with genuine intent. We need to ensure that these initiatives are not just symbolic gestures." "I understand," the mayor responded, his voice steady and earnest. "Let me know when you're ready to discuss further." The following morning, Malcolm stood in front of the courthouse, the early morning light casting a serene glow over the quiet square. The building, which had once represented the burden of a flawed system, now symbolized a new beginning. As he ascended the steps, he saw Sarah waiting for him, her presence a reassuring anchor amid the uncertainty. "You ready for the next chapter?" she asked, her smile reflecting a mix of encouragement and camaraderie. "Ready as I'll ever be," Malcolm replied, a sense of calm enveloping him. Although Grafton remained deeply divided and grappling with its identity, there was a newfound willingness to confront the issues that had long been suppressed. Malcolm felt a strong conviction that as long as he remained committed, there was hope for meaningful progress. "You know," Sarah said as they entered the courthouse, "you could have left after the trial. No one would have blamed you." Malcolm met her gaze with a serious but warm expression. "I didn't come here to walk away when things got tough. I came here to stay and build something enduring." "And that's exactly what you're doing," Sarah said, her voice imbued with pride and respect. As they stepped into the courthouse, Malcolm felt a deep sense of peace. The fight was far from over, but for the first time he felt a profound sense of belonging and purpose. It was the beginning of a new chapter, not just for him, but for the town of Grafton. The road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, but Malcolm was resolute and prepared for whatever lay ahead. Thanks for joining us on this journey through Malcolm Robinson's challenging first days in Grafton. We've seen the complexities of navigating a new environment, the subtle and not so subtle biases that can shape a person's experience, and the critical role of standing up for justice in the face of adversity. So, what have you learned from Malcolm's story so far? How do you think these lessons can apply to your own life and the ways you handle challenges and biases? Share one thing you've learned or plan to bring into practice below this video. I'd love to hear your thoughts and insights. If you liked this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Your support helps us continue to create content that matters. Thanks for watching.